So up first, I was genuinely shocked to see this story emerge, but California Governor Gavin Newsom, who is a hardcore progressive, actually just vetoed some legislation that trans rights activists were pushing. Yes, even California may be turning against gender madness. Take a listen to this clip from local news breaking down the legislation.
We've learned that Governor Gavin Newsom has vetoed two major bills. One, driverless big rigs, and the other could impact the parents of trans children. The bill, AB 957, would have required judges to consider a parent's affirmation of their child's gender identity in custody cases when parents split up.
The author of the bill said it was meant to protect trans kids in contentious custody battles. And in explaining the veto, the governor said, quote, "I urge caution when the executive and legislative branches of state government attempt to dictate in prescriptive terms that single out one characteristic legal standards for the judicial branch to apply."
The long and the short of it is basically this legislation, Assembly Bill 957, it would have required family courts when they're adjudicating custody cases to consider whether or not parents are affirming the gender of their child. In practice, this would probably mean that it'd be held against parents who did not affirm their child's gender, even in situations where that might make sense, like if they doubt the efficacy of the treatments being provided to gender-confused kids, if their kid hasn't been stable in that identity for a very long time, or if their kid has a history of trying different identities out for size. So apparently, this legislation was so extreme that even Gavin Newsom couldn't get on board. He put out a lengthy statement explaining his decision. Let's look at that. He says, "To the members of the California State Assembly, I am returning Assembly Bill 957 without my signature." That means he's basically vetoing it. And they could actually override that veto if they had a supermajority vote, but he's not putting his name on it. Newsom says, "This legislation would require a court, when determining the best interests of a child in a child custody or visitation proceeding, to consider, among other comprehensive factors, a parent's affirmation of the child's gender identity or gender expression. I appreciate the passion and values that led the author to introduce this bill. I share a deep commitment to advancing the rights of transgender Californians, an effort that has guided my decisions through many decades in public office. That said, I urge caution when the executive and legislative branches of a state government attempt to dictate, in prescriptive terms that single out one characteristic, legal standards for the judicial branch to apply. Other-minded elected officials in California and other states could very well use this strategy to diminish the civil rights of vulnerable communities. Moreover, a court under existing law is required to consider a child's health, safety, and welfare when determining the best interests of a child in these proceedings, including the parent's affirmation of the child's gender identity." So there's a lot to unpack here, but I do want to highlight one point that Newsom makes, and man, I really did not think I would ever be finding myself defending Gavin Newsom on this podcast, but here we are. I'm going to give it to you straight, whether it's Team Red or Team Blue. I'll tell you if I think they're right or wrong on any given issue. He's absolutely right to caution against this tactic, because imagine a red state could follow up and do this and say that in our state, it will be held against a parent if they affirm a gender identity of the child during a custody or visitation dispute process. Forcing these complicated ideological and cultural and scientific controversies into family court is not a good idea. But to help you understand the case being made for this legislation a little bit more, I'm going to play a clip from Assemblywoman Lori Wilson, a Democrat, who introduced the legislation. If you're watching on video, it freezes a couple times, but you'll be able to hear just fine the point she's making in defense of this legislation.
So this particular bill adds the very important factor that affirming a child's gender identity is in their best interest, which is what your question is about. Why does it actually say that in an affirmative way? And it really is because if you have a 7-year-old who's talking about having a potential to say, being able to articulate that they believe that they are not the same gender as they are biologically, then it should be affirmed. And through care, it should be determined. And that's what we did with our own child. And that would give the ability for a parent who wasn't sure to affirm and get their child the care that they need to make that, till they can begin to articulate that determination. But by saying and rejecting it in wholesale, then you're essentially rejecting your child. And that is not in the best interest of a child. We should be affirming our children in every possible way and getting them whatever appropriate care they need, whether it's based on their gender, whether it's based on how their studies are in school. It doesn't matter. Our children should be affirmed. And this is saying that you have to include gender affirmation as a part of that.
So there is a lot to unpack here, but for one, it's just not true to say that by rejecting your child's gender identity or even just not affirming it, like maybe having questions, being skeptical, you're therefore rejecting your child entirely. That's not true. Lots of parents who love their kids and truly have their kids' best interest in mind might have concerns or questions about these newfangled identities, and whatever they say might not want to just instantly affirm it. That doesn't make them bad parents. In fact, I would say some degree of skepticism of these things is actually probably part of being a good parent, but regardless, it shouldn't endanger their custody or visitation rights. And it's insane that this Assemblywoman thinks we should always affirm kids. I worked with kids for many years. I actually worked at the YMCA and daycare and lifeguarding and camp counseling. And I had kids of all different ages tell me many things that were not true about things they've done, about things about them. They have wild imaginations. They also believe in the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. The idea that a parent's role is to blindly affirm a child's sense of the world, even though that sense of the world is inherently underdeveloped, is not just wrong, but it's actually the opposite of the truth. As a kid gets older, part of a parent's role is to help them sort truth from fiction, which inherently requires not affirming everything they say. It's also just, despite what folks like this say, it is not at all clear what the best way to treat kids who experience gender confusion or gender dysphoria is at this point. Many other countries are walking back the affirmative care model of immediately affirming an identity, of putting a kid on puberty blockers, of giving them cross-sex hormones, of having them never go through their birth sex puberty. A lot of other countries are rolling that back. They're hitting pause. And the evidence that's touted to support it is often studies that have big methodological issues or apply to adults that were studied or apply to kids who had gender dysphoria their whole lives from an extremely young age and then transitioned, and that's now being applied to draw conclusions about people who are suddenly experience gender confusion at age 12, even though that's a fundamentally different cohort, so the studies really don't apply. There are not good data and studies on the effectiveness of many of these medical transitions, and we don't know, we don't have all the answers that it's just absolutely 100% what's best for a kid. And I do want to be clear that courts already can, in California and elsewhere, consider the well-being and safety of the child. So, if you have a case where a parent is truly hateful bigot and their child is saying they identify as trans or something, and that parent is abusing the child because of that sense of self-identity, that's already something that can be used against them in court and should be. If they are, verbally or physically or in any way abusing or mistreating their child because of their gender identity or because of anything else, that already can and should be, without this legislation, held against them in family court. So you're just going above and beyond to put your finger on the scale as the government on a certain side of a deeply controversial political, social, and scientific debate and try to micromanage people's parenting decisions with the threat of taking their kids away. That's just a really bad idea, and it's not necessary because courts already have the tools they need to protect kids. The progressives pushing this kind of thing are only going to engender even more backlash. I mean, think for how long the right, and often falsely, honestly, often using tropes or stereotypes that weren't borne out by the evidence, they would say things like, they're coming for your kids, those gays are coming for your kids. Well, now, in a certain sense, in this specific scenario, progressive trans rights activists literally are coming for your kids. They're saying that if you don't fall in line with their approach to parenting and their position on these complex issues, that you should have custody held against you by the state. That is quite something. That is a radical attack on one of the things that people hold most dear in their life, their kids. The backlash that this kind of overreach will obviously cause is crystal clear. So if you actually want what's best for the transgender community or the LGBT community at large, you should not support this kind of insane overreach because it's only going to lead most of society to further turn against this community and this movement. And if that happens, it won't be the bigots to blame. It will be the woke activists who refuse to stop helping.